Welcome to Queen Deluxe. Let's do some vintage sewing. This episode, we cut out the pattern for a mock-up of this 1920s DIY reconstruction. I will show you how to do a proper pattern layout, and we will talk about how to find the straight of grain on your fabric.
The tools I am using today are a 2-inch ruler, dressmaking shears, tracing wheel, sewing pins, and tailor's chalk. To get started cutting our mock-up, we need to lay out our muslin and gather our pattern pieces. But before we get to pinning, let's talk about following the grain line. I have a Butterick Art of Dressmaking book from 1927. It says, the question of grain or thread of the material is very important. All fabrics are finished on each side with a border called a selvage. Woven materials are made with lengthwise and crosswise threads. The lengthwise warp threads run parallel to the selvage. The crosswise woofed or weft threads run across the warp, and it is the turning back of the thread at the end of the line that makes the selvage.
All right, so I have a quarter circle cut out of muslin here, and I've marked it up with my pink Sharpie so we can talk about grain line. We have straight of grain here, which is the strongest. It is the part that is got the factory edge. We have the cross, that would be your cut line at when you get your fabric cut at a fabric store. It has a little bit of stretch, as you can see. And then we have the bias, which is a 45-degree angle. So if you came 8 inches here and 8 inches here and then pulled, you have the greatest amount of stretch. Okay, you can use that knowledge to construct garments that hang straight, that curve to the body, and we can use this to our best advantage. So we have the straight of grain going down the center front, cross grain going this way around the waist, and bias, this dashed line going at a 45-degree angle. So just so you can see kind of how the grain affects things and why it is so important to get your pattern pieces on grain when you're cutting out. So the straight of grain wants to hang plumb. It wants to hang straight. So why fight that? Put it where you want your fabric to hang straight, down your center fronts, down the side seams. Or if you and put that bias where you want a little more shape. So it's gonna go right over that hip, right over the stomach area. So it's giving you shape. And I pinned out a little bit of dart here just so that you can see that you can't get it all out because it's not a knit. Right, here it is hanging from the corner. Right here, straight of grain on this side. I have the cross here and the bias running straight down the middle. And we have those nice 2 folds. So see how those, even when it's like coming from a corner, that cross and that straight want to hang straight. Now this is not very drapey fabric being muslin, but it's trying to get there. It's trying to hang plumb. All right, you're saying to yourself, why is the grain line so important? Why is she going on and on about grain line and straight of grain and cross grain and bias? Because it's magical, and I guys want to spread the word on how important grain line is. So I have on the dress form our quarter circle. I have the bias running down center front and the straight of grain running on the side and the cross grain going the other direction here. You can see how we get like this nice smooth line across the bust. And I can't get all the fullness out because I don't have it going maybe all the way. I don't have a big enough piece to swing that bias. And it's not the drapiest of fabrics being muslin. But you can see how it changes its appearance when you change the grain line. So pay attention to where those grain lines are on your pattern pieces and get it lined up. All right, so I have my muslin laid out on my table. This is the fold, and that is the selvage. So the factory edge is coming off of the bolt at Joann's, kind of like this. Here's our cut edge, so that's the cross grain, and then parallel to the selvage is the straight of grain. I have my back piece laid out on the fabric. It's not pinned yet, so I just wanted to show you what we got going on. I have the satin facing marked there. And the satin that is across the shoulder blade is marked. I have the piece labeled back. This stands for no seam allowance. I always use my patterns without seam allowance and actually draw the seam allowance on. I'll show you how to do that. And we only need to cut one. So I'm actually gonna open this fabric up. This is the center back line and the straight of grain. The double-ended arrow, that always means straight of grain. Coming down, we have the hip band, and that's that embroidery section. So I have that marked. On a muslin, I don't need to notate, like I don't need to cut a separate piece for where the embroidery is. I just need to know where it is. So I'm just gonna mark that so that we can see where it should be on the mock-up.
Vintage patterns from the 1920s are made from tissue paper and have small perforations used to notate cutting layout instructions. The large triple perforations are a symbol to lay that piece on the fold. The double are for the straight of grain.
All right, so I have, this is at 10 and 5/8. That's gonna be, ooh, right on the money, 10 and 5/8. So I can pin this down. So I've measured from my straight of grain or center back line to parallel to the selvage. And now we know we're right on grain. To mark it, I have a chalk pencil. It's kind of like a mechanical pencil. The chalk comes in a bunch of different colors. I'm going to mark around the pattern piece like this. So that's going to be our stitch line. And I'm going to do a 3/4 inch seam allowance on the side seams, which is a little bit big, but that'll be for fitting. And then a 1/2 inch at the arm side. And we'll go back to 3/4 at the shoulder. And 1/2 inch at the hip. And then you cut it out. Now I'm going to cut the rest of the pieces. I have to transfer these markings onto the front of this garment. So I have some tracing paper mounted onto a cardboard that I got at the drugstore. And then it's masking taped on here. Turn it this way. And then I have a tracing wheel, basic, it's from Joann's. I'll put it in the description below. And I will also put a link to this really big tracing paper in case you want to do this ever. And now I'm going to go along my line. This is the embroidery line, just so that we can tell where that is in the mock-up. And then I'm going to go across my satin line for the shoulder blade detail. 1 and 2. I have already punched through, there we go,
where that line is, like that. Thanks for cutting out with me today and for sticking with me through my extensive grain line lesson. If you had fun, give me a like. If you learned something, why don't you subscribe? Next video, I sew up the mock-up we cut out today. See you next time.